What if everything you are experiencing right now is not coming from the world, but from the conversations you are having within yourself? What if nothing is happening to you, and everything is being spoken into form, quietly and continuously through the words you repeat in your own mind? Because if you look closely, you will notice something you've always overlooked. Not what you say out loud, but what you are constantly saying within. There is a movement inside you that never stops. A current of thought that takes shape in words. And those words are not passive. They are not meaningless. They are formative. They are building something. They are selecting something. They are shaping what you call reality. And yet, you treat them casually. You let them run without direction, without awareness, without intention. You react, you argue, you replay conversations, you imagine outcomes you do not want, and then you wonder why life continues to mirror the same patterns. Because the truth is simple, but not obvious. You are always speaking, even in silence, and that speech is not separate from creation, it is creation. So again, quietly, what are you saying when no one is listening? Because that is the conversation that matters. Not what you declare in moments of motivation, not what you affirm for a few minutes, but what you return to throughout the day without noticing. That is your true voice. That is your true assumption. That is your state. And your state is what becomes your world. You have been given something extraordinary, something so constant that you stop seeing it as power, the ability to think in words, to speak internally, to form meaning, to construct identity. And this ability is not small, it is not secondary. It is the very mechanism of creation. Mind and speech are not two separate things. They are one movement. Thought taking shape as word, word carrying feeling, feeling becoming assumption, assumption becoming fact. And if that is true, then nothing in your life is random. Nothing is accidental. Nothing is outside the structure of what you have been inwardly sustaining. So the problem is not that life is difficult. The problem is that your inner dialogue is unconscious. You are spending it instead of investing it. You are letting it flow into reaction, into fear, into doubt, into repetition, instead of directing it toward what you actually choose to be. Because every thought you entertain, every conversation you replay, every scenario you imagine is either reinforcing the old state or building a new one. There is no neutral. So the question becomes sharper. Are you investing your inner speech or are you wasting it? Because to invest means you expect a return. And whether you realize it or not, you are always receiving returns. The only question is from what? From fear or from fulfillment? From doubt or from certainty? From reaction or from creation? And the moment you see this, even slightly, something shifts not outside, but in how you listen to yourself. Because now you begin to notice the tone, the direction, the content of your inner voice. You begin to hear what you have been repeating unconsciously. And once you hear it, you can no longer ignore it. Because now you see that every inner conversation is a choice. Not always deliberate at first, but always available to be changed. So the work is not to silence the mind. The work is to direct it, to take the same inner dialogue you have always had and give it a new premise, not from lack, but from fulfillment. Not from becoming, but from being. Because the moment you begin to speak from the state of already having, something begins to reorganize within you. The words feel different. The tone changes. The identity shifts. And identity is what reality follows. So you do not need to force the world to change. You do not need to manipulate circumstances. You do not need to wait for evidence. You need to listen and then choose differently. Because the coin has always been in your hand, mind and speech. And the way you use it determines everything. And once you begin to notice this inner conversation, not as something abstract, but as something constant and active, something you are participating in every moment, whether you intend to or not, the entire process of change becomes clearer. Not easier perhaps, but simpler. Because now you see that nothing needs to be added to you. Nothing needs to be imported from outside. Nothing needs to be given to you that you do not already possess. The only thing that needs to change is what you are already doing unconsciously. Because you are already thinking, you are already speaking internally, you are already imagining, you are already rehearsing scenarios. The only difference between the life you have and the life you want is the direction of that inner dialogue. Not the presence of it, but the content of it. So again, quietly. What are you rehearsing without realizing it? Because rehearsal is creation. Every time you replay a memory, every time you anticipate failure, every time you imagine something going wrong, you are not preparing yourself. You are projecting a state, and that state must express itself not because the world is against you, but because the world is consistent. It reflects what you sustain. And this is where something subtle but powerful shifts. You stop trying to control outcomes, and you begin to control direction. Not forcing results, but choosing the premise from which results must come. Because if the premise changes, the outcome cannot remain the same. So the work becomes internal, precise, almost invisible. You catch yourself in the act. You notice when the inner dialogue drifts into the old pattern. You notice when you begin to speak from lack, from fear, from doubt. And instead of following it, instead of letting it run, you interrupt it. Not violently, not forcefully, but deliberately. And you replace it, not with empty words, not with forced positivity, but with a conversation that implies the fulfillment of what you desire. A conversation that would be natural if it were already true, because that is the key. You are not trying to convince yourself. You are stepping into a different version of yourself. And that version speaks differently, feels differently, assumes differently. So you begin to ask, if it were already done, what would I be saying right now? And then you say it internally, quietly. Naturally, you hear the tone, you feel the shift, you accept it, even if only for a moment. And then like before, you drift. But now you notice, and that changes everything. Because once you notice, you are no longer unconscious. And once you are no longer unconscious, you are no longer trapped. You can choose again. And every time you choose again, you strengthen the new direction. You reinforce the new state. You make it more familiar, more natural, more real. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifts. The old conversation loses its dominance. The new one begins to feel less like effort and more like identity. And when it becomes identity, it no longer requires maintenance. It becomes automatic. So the question sharpens once more. Are you willing to guide your inner speech, or will you continue to follow it? Because one leads to repetition and the other leads to creation. And once you begin to guide your inner speech instead of following it, something deeper becomes available. Not just control, but direction with intention. Because now you are no longer reacting to thoughts. You are selecting them, shaping them, using them as instruments rather than being carried by them. And this is where imagination becomes precise, not random, not scattered, but deliberate. Because you are no longer thinking about what you want, you are thinking from it. And that distinction changes everything. Because thinking about keeps you separate. It keeps you observing. It keeps you in distance. But thinking from places you inside the experience, it collapses distance. It makes the unseen feel immediate, real, present. And once something feels present, it begins to define you. So again, quietly. Are you thinking of your desire or from it? Because if you are thinking of it, you are still outside, still waiting, still measuring, still hoping that something will happen. But if you are thinking from it, you are no longer waiting, you are participating, you are embodying, you are already there in consciousness. And consciousness is the only place where anything ever begins. And this is why inner dialogue becomes the most powerful tool you have. Because it allows you to construct a scene, not visually perfect, not detailed in every aspect, but emotionally real. Something that implies your desire has already been fulfilled. Something that would naturally occur if it were already true. and then you enter that conversation. You hear the words, you feel the response. You accept the exchange, not as imagination in the sense of fantasy, but as experience. Something happening now, something you are part of, something that includes you fully. And in that moment, you are no longer trying to create, you are expressing a state. And that state is what reality must follow. Because what you consistently return to internally becomes your identity. And identity is what organizes the outer world. Not instantly perhaps, not always visibly at first, but inevitably, because the outer world has no choice but to align with what you are being. So the process becomes simpler again, but deeper. You do not need to imagine many things. You do not need to repeat endlessly. You do not need to force clarity. You need to enter one scene, one conversation, one moment that implies fulfillment, and experience it as real, and then allow it to settle. Not checking it, not questioning it, not pulling away from it, but letting it become part of you. And then naturally you will drift again, thoughts will come, reactions will appear, the old patterns will try to return, but now you recognize them, now you see them as movements, not truths, and because you see them, you are no longer compelled to follow them. You can return, and every return deepens the state. Every return strengthens the identity. Every return makes the imagined more natural than the observed. And when the imagined becomes more natural than the observed must change. So the question sharpens once more. Are you willing to live from what you have imagined even before you see it? Because that is the threshold, not when it appears, but when it feels like you. And this is where the process becomes real. Not when you are imagining in stillness, not when everything feels aligned, but when the outer world presents something that does not match what you have assumed. Because in that moment you are no longer practicing, you are choosing. And what you choose reveals what you actually believe, not what you say you believe, not what you repeat occasionally, but what you return to when something challenges you. Because it is easy to feel fulfilled when nothing contradicts you. It is easy to assume when there is no resistance. But the moment something appears that denies your assumption, something automatic happens. You feel it, you react to it, you begin to question, and without realizing it, you shift back into the old state. Not because you failed, but because you identify with what you saw. And what you identify with, you become. So again, quietly, when reality contradicts you, who do you become? Do you become the version of yourself that waits for proof, that reacts to appearances, that adjusts based on what is visible? Or do you remain as the one who has already assumed it is done? Because that moment, that single internal shift, determines everything that follows. And this is why most people feel inconsistency, because they remain in the state only when it is comfortable, only when it is easy, only when nothing opposes it. But the moment something challenges it, they abandon it, and then they wonder why the result disappears. It does not disappear. They leave it. So the discipline is not in imagining more, it is not in forcing belief, it is not in controlling every thought, it is in remaining, in staying as the one who has already chosen, regardless of what appears, not denying the world, but understanding its nature, that it reflects what has been, not what is being chosen now. Because what you see is always delayed. It is always showing you the result of previous states, previous assumptions, previous conversations. And if you react to it, you return to those previous states. But if you remain in your new assumption, you move beyond it. So the work becomes precise, almost silent. You see the contradiction, you feel the pull to react, and instead of following it, you pause. Not physically perhaps, but inwardly, and you return. Return to the state. Return to the feeling. Return to the identity. Not once, but as often as needed. Because every time you return, instead of react, you weaken the old state and strengthen the new one, not by fighting it, but by replacing it. And over time, something stabilizes. The new state no longer feels temporary. It no longer feels like something you are holding. It begins to feel like something that holds you. And when it holds you, you no longer leave, because there is nowhere else to return to. And when you begin to remain instead of react, something else quietly disappears. The need to keep doing, the urge to repeat, the subtle anxiety that tells you maybe you should imagine again, just to make sure. Because at that point, you are no longer trying to create. You are maintaining a state, and a state does not require constant reinforcement when it has been accepted as natural. It only requires that you do not abandon it. Because the moment you feel that something is already done, truly done, not as an idea but as a quiet inner certainty, repetition loses its purpose, effort loses its meaning, and what remains is something much simpler: trust. Not blind belief, not false confidence, but a natural acceptance that what has been assumed is already in motion. So again, quietly, are you imagining because it is done, or because you think it is not? Because if you are imagining from the feeling that it is not yet real, then every act of imagination reinforces distance. It keeps you in the state of waiting. It keeps you in the identity of someone who is trying to make something happen. But if you imagine from the knowing that it is already fulfilled, then even a single moment is enough, because the state has been entered. And once entered, it only needs to be maintained, not recreated. And this is where many unknowingly return to effort. They imagine, they feel it, and then instead of resting in it, they begin to check, to look, to measure, to ask when it will appear. And in doing so, they shift back into the state of not having, not because the process failed, but because they change states. So the deeper discipline is not in doing more, but in not undoing what has already been done. Not digging up the seed, not questioning the assumption, not returning to doubt. Because once the seed is planted, it does not need your interference. It does not need your constant attention. It needs your consistency in not replacing it with something else. And this is where inner stillness becomes important, not as silence, but as stability. A quiet refusal to move away from what you've already accepted as true, even when nothing yet reflects it, even when appearances remain unchanged, even when time seems to pass without evidence. Because time is not the cause, it is the unfolding. An unfolding happens naturally when the state is sustained. So the process simplifies again, but deepens. You imagine, you feel, you accept, and then you rest. Not waiting, not hoping, but being. Allowing the state to settle into identity, allowing it to become the version of you that feels normal. And when it feels normal, you no longer question it. And when you no longer question it, it is done. And when you truly stop undoing the state, when you no longer interfere with what you have assumed, something begins to reveal itself with a kind of quiet precision. You start to see that the world is not responding randomly. It is responding faithfully, almost mechanically, to what you have been being. Not what you occasionally think, not what you briefly imagine, but what you consistently return to. And this realization changes your relationship with everything you see, because now you no longer interpret events as causes. You see them as reflections, not as forces acting upon you, but as echoes of states you've already occupied. And once you see that, even slightly, something loosens. The need to react fades. The urgency to fix things outside begins to dissolve, because you recognize that what you are seeing is not something to fight, it is something to understand. So again, quietly, are you reacting to the reflection, or are you returning to the source? Because reacting keeps you inside the loop. It keeps you tied to what has already been created. It keeps you reinforcing the same state that produced it. But returning to the source allows you to shift the cause. And when the cause shifts, the effect cannot remain the same. And this is where awareness becomes your greatest power. Not control, not force, not resistance, but awareness. Because awareness allows you to see the movement of your own state, to notice when you have slipped back into the old identity, to recognize when you are speaking again from lack, from fear, from doubt. And in that moment of recognition, you are no longer trapped. You are no longer unconscious. You have a choice. And choice is where creation happens. So the process becomes almost effortless in its structure. Even if it still requires attention, you notice, you choose, you return, and you remain. Not perfectly, not without interruption, but consistently enough that the new state begins to dominate, begins to feel more real than the old one, begins to define how you see yourself without effort. And when it defines how you see yourself, it begins to define how the world responds to you. Not because you change the world directly, but because the world cannot respond to anything other than what you are being. So the reflection starts to shift, sometimes subtly, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes in ways that feel almost coincidental, but when you look closer, you begin to see the pattern. You begin to recognize the alignment. You begin to realize that nothing is happening randomly. Everything is following a structure, a law, a consistency that has always been there. And that law is simple, but absolute. What you are is what appears. Not what you wish you were, not what you try to be, but what you consistently return to without effort. So the question sharpens again. What are you returning to when you are not paying attention? Because that is your true state, and that state is already shaping your world. And when you begin to see that what you return to is what shapes your world, something settles at a deeper level, not as excitement, not as intensity, but as a quiet authority, a knowing that does not need to prove itself, because it is no longer based on what you see. It is based on what you have accepted as true within yourself. And this is where identity becomes stable. Because until this point, you were still moving between states, sometimes aware, sometimes not, sometimes choosing, sometimes reacting. But now, something shifts. You are no longer experimenting, you are deciding. Not temporarily, not conditionally, but deliberately. So again, quietly, have you decided who you are, or are you still waiting to see it first? Because waiting belongs to the old state, the one that depends on evidence, the one that looks outward for confirmation, the one that measures reality before accepting it, but decision reverses that completely. It accepts first, it assumes first, it becomes first, and only then does reality follow. And this is why decision carries a different feeling than hope. It is not tense, it is not urgent, it is not emotional in the way most people expect. It is calm, grounded, almost quiet, because once something is decided internally, there is nothing left to argue about. There is nothing left to question. There is nothing left to prove. It is done. And when something is done in that way, you no longer feel the need to check. You no longer feel the need to monitor progress. You no longer feel the need to repeat the process, because repetition belongs to uncertainty, but certainty rests. So the state stabilizes, not because you're holding it tightly, but because you're no longer leaving it. There is no alternative you are returning to, no old identity you are slipping back into unconsciously, because you have seen through it. You have recognized it, and once recognized, it no longer has the same hold over you. And this is where something else disappears, the sense of time as delay, because you're no longer measuring how long it takes. You're no longer counting days. You're no longer asking when it will appear, because from the perspective of being, there is no waiting. There is only expression. And expression is already happening. So the outer world begins to align, not because you are watching it, but because you are no longer interfering with it. You are no longer shifting states. You are no longer contradicting yourself internally. And that consistency allows the reflection to become clear, stable, undeniable. Because reality does not need effort to follow you. It only needs consistency. And once you are consistent, something becomes obvious. Something that was always true but rarely seen. You were never trying to change your life. You were learning to remain as the one who already has. And when you remain as that one, there's nothing left to achieve. There is only something to express. And then, almost without noticing when it happened, something ends. Not your desires, not your movement, not your engagement with life, but the effort behind it, the subtle tension of trying to make something happen, the quiet habit of checking whether anything is working, the need to confirm through the senses that what you have assumed is real, because once you remain long enough in the state, that entire structure collapses on its own, not because you forced it to disappear, but because it no longer belongs to who you are. Because the one who was trying is no longer the one you identify with. And when that identity dissolves, something becomes clear in a way that cannot be reversed. You were never trying to change the world. You were only moving between states, between assumptions, between versions of yourself, and whichever one you occupied consistently became your reality. So again, quietly, was anything ever missing, or were you simply not remaining? Because now you see it, not as theory, not as philosophy, but as something direct, something immediate, something undeniable. You are the source, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but functionally, because everything you experience passes through you, is shaped by you, is defined by what you accept as true. And once that is seen deeply, something irreversible happens. You stop searching, you stop asking how, you stop wondering when, because all of those belong to the state of not having, and you are no longer in that state. You are being, and being does not wait. Being does not question. Being does not try. It simply expresses. So whatever you accept as true now is what you are. And what you are is what appears, not because you force it, not because you chase it, but because it cannot be otherwise. Reality does not argue with you. It does not resist you. It does not delay you. It reflects you. Always. And this is why everything becomes simple at the end. Not easy perhaps, but clear. Because there is only one place to look, one place to choose, one place to return to the state you are willing to remain in. Not once, not occasionally, but as identity. And when it becomes identity, there is no more practice, no more method, no more technique. There is only expression, the natural unfolding of what you have already accepted as true. Because reality has never been ahead of you. It has always been following you.